senior thesis. Great, recording in progress. And so kind of what we're working on is to create a guide for state planners to inform fishermen's engagement in CCAP processes. So that's the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan processes that we talked about in the last webinar. I think they'll also be touched on in this webinar. And so what the aim of the guide is to help state planners understand where fishermen fit into these CCAP processes, how they can be engaged, the best ways to engage fishermen, and then how to prioritize fishery-friendly climate solutions, which is kind of the purpose of this webinar. So fits in all very nicely. And so that's a little bit about me and the work I'm doing with the Fishery-Friendly Climate Action Campaign. And so I will call on the next person to introduce themselves. And then after that, if you could call on somebody you see in the Zoom, if you forget, I can also call on people. So I will call on Matt.
Thanks, Sophia. So my name's Matt Chester. My background's in the world of energy policy. So with the campaign Sophia mentioned, I'm coming at it as a newbie to the world of fisheries, but with some deep experience in the world of energy policy, climate modeling, all that stuff. So I'm trying to learn from you guys, share some information and ideas I have about how these decarbonization models work, and hopefully, those powers combined can help fulfill a lot of those goals that Sophia was just talking about. And I'll pass it to the next box I see on my screen, at least, is Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Merrick. I am retired from NOAA Fisheries. My last gig there was I was chief scientist. So I spent the last 5 years in DC, a lot of which was involved trying to move climate as an issue into fisheries. A lot of time spent on the Hill talking to congressionals. Since then, I've done a variety of things, and one of those is that I'm the New England Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee, along with Gareth, who I'm going to call on next. And I also do a lot of work with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, more frequent peer reviewer of their stock assessments. And environmental/climate issues continue to be a big issue there as to how we can deal with a lot of these issues. We have 2 research track efforts coming up that are going to really focus on how to get climate into assessments and then into the projections. And I'll turn it over to Gareth Lawson.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Gareth Lawson. I'm at the Conservation Law Foundation. I'm a scientist there in the ocean program. So I'm also, like Richard said, on the New England Council at SSC. So I grapple at the SSC with, climate and fisheries, and also certainly at CLF where we're grappling with it. We have an energy program that does climate action plans. I'm not in that, but I sort of, try and talk with those people a little bit too. So here to learn, and thanks for organizing. And I'll pass it to Carl, who's the next window on my screen.
So I'm Carl Tiska, and I am a recreational angler who's just interested in the fishery and the science and climate. And the next one, who I believe hasn't gone below me, is Julia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Logan. I'm the Administrative Director for the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association. I am relatively new to the team. I started back in September, but I come from a family of fishermen. So personally invested, and now career-wise, I'm invested, and I work very closely with Beth Cassoni. So thank you for having me. And I'm going to pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. Katie Almeida. I work for the Town Dock down in Narragansett, Rhode Island. The Town Dock, in case you guys aren't familiar, is a seafood dealer and processor, and our main product is squid. So if you've eaten some calamari, it's probably coming from us. My role at the Town Dock is as a senior representative of government relations and sustainability. I deal mainly my day-to-day in fishery regulations and management, attending the council meetings. I'm on some advisory panels, but as we all know, climate change is playing a big role in fishery regulations, whether the regulations realize it or not, managers realize it or not, but it's going to, and climate change is already having an impact on our fisheries. So we need to catch up. So I'm super interested in this subject and I'm happy to participate.
All right, Lindsay, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Perk-Fairchild. I work for Empire Fisheries, which is a fishing fleet mainly focused on scallops out of Stonington, Connecticut.
Thank you, Lindsay. Kevin, could you introduce yourself?
Hi there, Kevin Scribner chiming in from the Pacific Northwest, and so have a variety of hats. So former Bristol Bay fisherman for a couple decades plus, still working on marketing from Bristol Bay, trying to create new channels of marketing from Bristol Bay. I have a little company called Forever Wild Seafood. But in addition to that, I'm on the board of the Marine Fish Conservation Network, and that's a coalition of groups that are weighing in on Magnuson Stevens, and it includes the Conservation Law Foundation that Gareth works on the Policy Council. I'm co-chair of that with Linda Bankin out of Sitka, Alaska, and then I'm chair of the Global Ocean Health nonprofit that's looking at just that, we're really focused on MCDR. And also, our primary vector that we're working with is to enable tribal leadership in that space. And then lastly, I'm a co-founder of the WAVE Foundation, based in Portland, that's looking at a lot about try to climate best practices and try to encourage, if not curate or steward venues like sports stadiums, things like that, to be on the right side of history in terms of climate. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And then Shay, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. My name is Shay Rooney. I'm here also with Fred Matera, and we're with the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island. We deal a lot with offshore wind. It's kind of part of our day-to-day. We have been working with Sarah for a while, talking about how we can kind of change like the negative narrative a little bit in terms of dealing with offshore wind and climate and everything, and be able to advocate for alternatives and for policy that alternatives that are fishery friendly. So we're really excited to be part of this campaign. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'm just Fred Matera, commercial fisherman, retired from 40 years of fishing out of Point Judith. So I've been all over this country. I've been out to Alaska with Linda and Eric, and also happy to be here.
Thank you. I think that's everybody except you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. We have a small crowd here, probably due to my, as usual, I'm still, 4 years into this, learning how to use Zoom, as many of you who've been on my webinars before know. We have sort of a Northeast heavy crowd, which is interesting. So, Kevin, you alone are kind of holding down the Alaska Northwest perspective here. You've got a lot on your shoulders. But I think this is appropriate too, because the Northeast is where I think of all the places, of all the regions around the country, where we have been most sort of in this, squeezed between sort of these simultaneous pressures in our fisheries of climate change occurring at the same time as the world, our states, our country are placing a lot of pressure on the ocean to solve climate change for us as well. And so folks like Fred and Shay, who spoke last, have really been grappling with that very much in their day-to-day for years. And that's why they were, along with me, the originators of this fishery-friendly climate action campaign that I now coordinate, which is it's a bi-coastal network. It includes participation of commercial fishermen from Alaska, the West Coast, and New England. So it is focused on commercial fishermen because we leverage a peer leadership model. It's led by fishermen for fishermen. And Our goal is to use community building, conversations, and this kind of organizing to create more of a space for fishermen's voices to be heard, both on climate impacts and climate solutions, and hopefully so that we can create more of a highlight the way, I guess, towards a more fishery friendly pathways to getting to our greenhouse gas reduction goals, both economy-wide and within our own businesses. I'm going to share my screen for just a minute to tee up our presentation today from Matt, which is our main course for the day. But let me just give you a little bit of background. Put this in presenter view. Yeah, no. As I said, still learning. Do you guys see all the little notes and stuff, or are you seeing one big slide?
If you hit that button at the top that says swap displays, I think it might bring over the view you're looking for.
Oh, got it. Yeah, thank you. Of course, I'm not on the right slide. Okay, so this is our webinar for today, Decarbonization Done Right, Integrating Fishery Impacts into Climate Action Models. There's probably a few terms in there that folks are wondering about. So basically the premise, and this is something I've been, that I and some of you on the call today, and some others who aren't on the call today have been sort of toying around with this concept for a couple of years without ever really getting it off the ground, just due to lack of bandwidth and a team and funding and all of that. But it's this concept of fishery-friendly climate action planning, which is, Shay almost alluded to this a minute ago. It's the idea that there's an end goal. So working backwards from step 4 on the right hand of the screen here, we have decarbonization goals. It remains to be seen exactly what happens to that at the national level right now. But for the last 4 years, it's been net zero by 2050, which is the same as the goal that's in the Paris Accord. And it's the same goal that many of our states have embraced. Other states have slightly differing goals, but they all have the basic idea. We're trying to get to a place where our greenhouse gas emissions are slowed to the point where they can be captured by greenhouse gas removal mechanisms, both natural and man-made, so that we are not adding to the greenhouse gas concentrations into the atmosphere that are causing the planet to warm. To do that, we have at our disposal a myriad of different mechanisms. And the idea between fishery-friendly climate action planning, going back to step 1 on the left hand of the screen, is that if we can combine expertise from fishing communities, from fisheries scientists, from energy modelers like Matt, who we have here to give our presentation today, then we can define all of those different tools at our disposal that can get us to our goals. We can put them in bins according to those that have more negative impacts to our fishery ecosystems, those that have positive impacts for our fishery ecosystems or co-benefits, and those that maybe just are totally neutral, have no impact on our fishery ecosystems. And then in step 3, we can use decarbonization models and advocacy and planning to try to steer our states, our country, our world to implementing less of those that we know have negative impact to fishery ecosystems, more of those that have positive impacts to fishery ecosystems, and some of those that have no impact to fishery ecosystems. This doesn't mean we can get to a place where we have no negative impacts at all. It just means we're thinking strategically from the get-go about how to design pathways to get to our decarbonization goals that are conscientiously trying to minimize negative impacts on fishery supporting ecosystems and communities, and conscientiously trying to maximize positive impacts for fishery ecosystems and their dependent communities. Right now, we have a really important and interesting opportunity to try to do this, because the EPA, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, has funded what is called climate pollution reduction grants across 45 states and a number of municipal metropolitan statistical areas, as well as tribes and territories. And what these CPRG grants are doing is they are funding climate action planning. It takes place in various different stages, but the stage that states are at right now is called a comprehensive climate action plan, or a CCAP. And those CCAPs, these are the states that receive them, so 45 states. Those CCAPs kind of consist of a series of planning steps that looks like this. They have to set a greenhouse gas reduction target if they don't already have one. So that it's a state could say, you know, we want net zero by 2050, or we want an 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. Those are some of the most common. But these goals have to be consistent with the goals that our country and the world are committed to. Then a state has to ensure that it has a way of inventorying greenhouse gas emissions from all of the different economic sectors within that state, and projecting forward what those emissions will be or could be under different scenarios in the next 3 decades. And then the state will have to select a series of measures. These can be policies, they can be investments, different actions that the state itself can undertake to make sure that its economy as a whole is getting to that greenhouse gas reduction target. And one of the things that the state can use when it's selecting those measures is what we're going to talk about today, which is decarbonization pathway modeling. In addition, after it's selected those measures, the state has to undertake a benefits analysis, which is another place where those who care about fisheries can encourage the state to evaluate impacts of the different measures it's selected on fishery supporting ecosystems and communities. And it has to undertake a series of other things. But we're really interested in this webinar series, and this is the second one in the series, in the things that are highlighted in dark blue, because we believe that those are the on-ramps where fishing communities and their allies can really center fisheries considerations in these comprehensive climate action plans. So today, we're going to talk about those decarbonization models. We're going to hear from Matt Chester, who is... I don't know how to read your bio while I've got this screen open. I'll come back to that in a second when I introduce you, Matt. So Matt's going to give us a half-hour presentation. Then we're going to have 15 minutes for clarifying questions. And then we've sort of separated the discussion sections into 2 chunks, because we have people on this webinar who have different forms of expertise. We have people who are living on the ocean as working fishermen, and we even have a recreational fisheries representative, which is really exciting. And then we have people who have spent their careers looking at data. And by sort of separately leveraging both of those kinds of expertise, I think we can have a really complementary discussion. So we're going to try to separate them if that works, and if it doesn't, we'll try something else. All right, so let me end this presentation and introduce our guest presenter here today. So Matt Chester is an energy consultant with over a decade of experience in energy policy analysis and carbon modeling, including work with the U.S. Department of Energy's rulemaking process, and an active role in providing actionable and useful feedback from stakeholders outside the government, like us, to get involved in these energy policy procedures. So thank you, Matt, for being here today. I'll hand this off to you.
Of course. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining today. Like Sarah said, and I already introduced myself, my name is Matt Chester, and again, I'm coming from the world of energy and decarbonization models, not from the world of fisheries, but I think we can do some really fun things by combining all of our knowledge and all our experience. And in saying that, I want to emphasize, and Sarah's agenda highlighted it, I'm here to share what I, put together, but it's not a one-sided lecture. It's the beginning, not just today, but moving forward of a larger conversation. So I'm here to learn from you as much as I am to share my insights and expertise. Your feedback is the invaluable feedback as, we seek to navigate this complex topic together. And I do recognize, again, Sarah mentioned that we have some scientists among us. So many of you in the audience are somewhat or maybe very familiar with models and systems ways of thinking. But again, I'm coming from the vantage point of those energy models. So again, with this conversation we're kicking off today, hopefully we can gain a more holistic understanding of the challenges and opportunities ahead. So with that, let me go to the next slide. And just to give a quick overview of my agenda today, the sub-agenda compared with Sarah's is I want to spend the majority of the time I have with you exploring decarbonization models, including the groundwork with some background information before showcasing a few examples of what they look like in practice, and then ultimately what are their applicability to those climate action plans we heard about. And again, all of this serves as a prelude to our ultimate objective, which is identifying what are those initial steps we can take now to initiate the development of decarbonization models that are incorporating feedback and insights from the fishery industry. So to kick off the introduction, and I won't go over this too much because we've heard in the introductions here before, but the goal here, bridging the worlds of energy, fishery models, shedding light on areas where maybe the fishery industry has been sidelined in considerations during previous and existing decarbonization efforts, policy discussions, et cetera, and then trying to discuss together how can we re-rectify that oversight. So with that, let's get to the interesting stuff, which is starting with the basics of the type of decarbonization models that I want to share with you all. And before really getting in, it helps to establish some basic definitions just to make sure we're on the same page. When I refer to a decarbonization model in the context of this presentation, what I'm talking about is models that simulate a range of prospective strategies, policies, technologies, all aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the sake of preventing climate change. So when governments or other entities, they commit to lofty targets to reduce emissions, lowering the human-driven carbon footprint, the kind of commitments that you read in headlines, hear in political speeches, it comes with the recognition that there's often a multitude of approaches to achieve those goals. And they are just setting the quantifiable goal without actually spelling out, well, here's the formula of how we'll get to 50%, 70%, 100% reduction in emissions by whatever the deadline is. And those types of actions that can be targeted to follow focus on things like replacing fossil fuels with clean energy, enhancing technological efficiency, exploring carbon capture solutions, things like that. So even if there is a complete consensus on the need for an emissions target and its specific level and deadline, and even today there's rarely such a consensus, but even if there is, that next step of mapping out the path to meet that goal, it's always going to lead to disagreement on, well, what's the most effective way to do that? What's the most affordable way to do that? What's the least impact way to do that and meet those goals? And that area of disagreement, that's where these decarbonization models come into play. The models are designed to explore, what are those different potential combinations of policies, investments, and other actions that can help us meet those emission reduction targets. What can they look like? Because again, there's not just one pathway there. And it's also important to differentiate decarbonization models from some other related terms. First, there's the idea of an energy model. An energy model is more about evaluating energy systems of a region, mapping out production, distribution, and consumption, but doing so in a way that doesn't necessarily consider the CO2 emissions. It's just saying, here's how we're meeting energy demand. So in contrast, a decarbonization model represents more of a specialized subset of those energy models, where it is specifically focusing on, okay, well, what is the impact to our emissions? And then additionally, you'll probably come across terms like climate roadmaps, climate action plans, carbon reduction plans, climate strategies. These are all kind of loosely defined, vaguer terms, but generally together, they refer to an entity's chosen strategy for meeting climate goals. So essentially, you can think of a decarbonization model is exploring various options for reducing emissions and their impacts, while that climate roadmap then outlines, well, which of those pathways are we choosing? Which of them are we actually going to put into practice? So climate roadmaps, they're informed by decarbonization models, where the individuals will then take the data outputs, subjectively review them, weigh how good and bad those co-benefits and those co-negative impacts are, weigh the costs, weigh the benefits, and for whether it's for the country, for the state, for the city, map that desired pathway forward. As a next step, I just want to make it tangible. So I'm going to walk through a few example decarbonization models that are out there. And I've highlighted some academic papers that are studying inputs and ultimate conclusions of various types of decarbonization models. There's no one size fits all. Again, it's kind of a broad term, but the examples here show a variety of use cases, outputs, and stakeholders. This first one is called Environmental Co-Benefits and Adverse Side Effects of Alternative Power Sector Decarbonization Strategies. It's often a mouthful when you look at these titles, but in simpler terms, this is a study that's examining the various mixes of energy sources on the grid aimed at steering us towards a net zero carbon footprint. And you can see that the concept of achieving a zero carbon grid, it's not as straightforward as it sounds. It encompasses a multitude of considerations. So for a very, very elementary example, if in this study we're comparing a scenario where we say we want 100% clean energy, 70% of that is renewables, 30% of that is nuclear, how does that compare to reversing that, 30% renewables and 70% nuclear? How do those different mixes impact things like pollutants, particulate matter, oxidant formation, human toxicity? And then furthermore, what are the economic implications that arise from that breakdown, or even the sub breakdown? Should we prioritize solar or wind, which is more economical immediately, long term? These are kind of the things that this type of decarbonization model can try to analyze. And additionally, it explores the ramifications of allowing fossil fuel generation, but doing so with carbon capture technology in place. So the graph that I've pulled out here, it's just one graph. It doesn't summarize the whole paper, but this one illustrates various net zero pathways that are modeled for the grid, each showing its unique set of environmental outcomes. And what's crucial to note here is that while all of these scenarios, they're displayed because they lead to the same outcome of decarbonization as outlined in this study, they do vary in terms of what are the resultant externalities. So these variations have far-reaching implications. They impact things like ecosystems, the economy, public health, and those are the factors that come into play. Another just quick example here with industrial decarbonization, modelizing the approaches and data challenges. Again, just one micro snapshot I'm pulling out here on this graph, but it's showing up across the top are different decarbonization strategies they've outlined. Down the side are different energy intensive sectors. And then what you see the results of the ranking, low, medium, high, about how impactful that decarbonization strategy is to those different sectors. So this highlights how decarbonization models, they can vary in outcome and ultimate benefits depending on the lens you're looking at. Somebody at a steel manufacturer plant and a chemical manufacturer plant, they might look at the same climate action plan and see very different positives and negatives as a result. And in fact, they very likely will. That's, there's a lot of different stakeholder groups that you have to consider. That's one of the potential outcomes out of these models. On this third one, modeling a net zero future, this graph is specific to policy approaches to decarbonization in the country of Nigeria. So again, but I pulled it out because it's a kind of a good example where we see a reference case called, business as usual compared with 3 different decarbonization pathways. Net zero with a CO2 tax, with abatement of methane as 1, net zero policy of CO2 tax alone as 2, and net zero policy that institutes both, so using one, the other, or both. So these are just 3 different methods this study wanted to explore. And the outputs here highlight the impact on GHG emissions. So that is overall climate success. And then the right graph, it shows the relative impacts of those pathways to the Nigerian crude oil industry. That's of great concern to this country, given how important it is to their economy. So to those in Nigeria who are looking at this specific decarb model, they can evaluate the study to highlight, what are the results from an emission standpoint versus how bad is that going to be for one of our main economic drivers? That's a very classic way for policymakers to use decarbonization models. And then last but not least, there's an interesting one here on land use and how decarbonization strategies can impact land use. So what we're seeing is a study of 2 different scenarios, one where decarbonization achieves 1.5 degrees of global temperature rate, it caps it there, versus one that caps it at 2 degrees rate of temperature rising. And how does that, what that does to the land that's available to be used for food production versus bioenergy crops. So again, different decarbonization strategies might prioritize taking that agricultural land for more bioenergy. That's a climate solution. but then that's going to harm the agricultural industry, the global food supplies, farmers. So this model is kind of studying how that might play out. And it's, again, important to note, I'm taking a tiny slice of these studies. This isn't me being an expert on any of these or saying, this is the conclusion, but just highlighting some of the manners in which these models, these decarbonization models, can and are currently being used to build towards policy solutions, climate action pathways, and specifically what those non-carbon related impacts might look like. So like I said earlier, we can agree by a consensus that we need to reduce emissions. We need to cut off the worst impacts of climate change. And it took us a long time to get close to that sort of a consensus, but that doesn't mean we're at all anywhere near a consensus on how to achieve that. So especially as these side impacts are like, the land use, the ecological impacts, these are only really now being studied in the depth they deserve. And so again, those previous examples highlight just some ways to get your thought processes flowing about what those decarbonization models might look like, how they are impacting these discussions. Those graphics I showed you, they're static. They can be a little bit hard to grasp without really diving into those papers. So I did want to just pull up these two examples of decarbonization models that are publicly available online. They're public-facing tools that are meant to be tinkered with. They serve as educational tools, and they really do drive home the idea of decarbonization models. So we're able to circulate these slides today. I've put in the hyperlinks to them, but you can also Google those two terms, the En-ROADS climate model and the energy policy simulator from Energy Innovation. But I wanted to pull these up because it's as a very quick snapshot for each of them. They allow users of these tools to play with different climate policies, investments, technology developments, and see what those impacts are to energy and emissions in the climate. So they serve as a very neat kind of first use tools. If someone thinks solving for climate change is easy, just go all in on this energy source, invest in this, I'd encourage them to open up one of these tools, finagle the different options until they meet those net zero goals or those emissions reduction goals in some way. And you can do that. These tools will let you get to a net zero, but that then highlights where the real difficult part comes, which is next. You then have to look at those fleet of options that you put the different levers at and think about, well, one, how do you sell that politically to be put into action? And two, how do you sell it to the public, specifically specialized groups and industries who are going to be impacted in an outweighted fashion? And if that policy recipe was put into motion, is that going to impact a certain type of industry in a very negative way? It shows how tough these decisions are to make. So again, these are just two publicly available models that I recommend playing around with, sharing with your peers. They do a great job of highlighting how many pathways there are, but also how challenging it can be to strike the right balance between technology and economics and political feasibility. So now that we have some of those common references and frameworks explained, I want to next briefly touch on the relevance to the conversation today, which is that comprehensive climate action plans, the EPA pollution reduction grant program that Sarah explained earlier. So what is the purpose of the climate action plans coming from states towards the grant reduction program? The first goal and way that these decarbonization models come into play is they help predict emissions reduction pathways. Decarbonization models provide states with some data-driven insights to identify what those achievable pathways are to reduce emissions across various sectors: transportation, industry, energy production. So it takes these lofty speeches, goals, we want climate action, and puts numbers behind them. And tackling emissions, it's a major undertaking. So you want to be sure that any actions that you might take, they have quantifiable impacts on those goals while also measuring expected impacts. And while those models aren't perfect and externalities come into play, unforeseen consequences, whatever it might be, that's our starting point for looking at these in a data-driven way. And then the second purpose is kind of flipping that. It's helping those policymakers to establish what are reasonable science-based targets. So they help the states, the municipalities, identify what those targets can be what are feasible pathways to get there, and also help those small entities, the states and the municipalities, get aligned with more national and international climate goals, and ensuring that they're aiming for measurable reductions that align with those, the broader U.S. commitment, while again kind of recognizing where those pathways are going to take them. And beyond those broad purposes, it's also then critical to understand, again, where these decarbonization models, how they functionally get involved. And the first I've highlighted is the concept of the scenario analysis. So by modeling various what-if scenarios, states can examine the impacts of different policy and technological choices, whether that be transitioning to renewable energy, really going in on energy efficiency, whatever it might be. The scenario analysis allows the policymakers to see, well, what are the range of potential impacts? How will this decarbonization pathway play out under strong economic conditions versus a weak economy? That's one example where, again, you can have the inputs, and it, rather than just have a single output, you can kind of play with those, those factors that you can't toggle, by choice. So if it's a good economy, a bad economy, if oil prices are high or low, then what will be the range of impacts of these policy pathways? Another key function is the cost and feasibility assessment. Models are used as a way to consider the economic viability of potentially proposed measures. And that's crucial for the states to develop realistic and thought out plans that are effective and able to be implemented. It also helps to measure the efficacy of a potential pathway versus the cost of it, since we know, the amount of funds that we have to invest in climate action, it's finite. We have a good amount of funds there, but we need to know where we're getting the most bang for our buck. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the impact assessment. So climate action plans, they look to decarbonization models to aid in measuring potential impacts on environmental and economic systems. And so again, it makes these models essential for understanding how policy changes could affect different sectors, different industries. And that's where we want to pull in the fishery side of things. We want to make sure we're looking at allowing the models to look at those potentially seen or unforeseen impacts to the fisheries and their necessary ecosystems. So specifically, a well-designed decarbonization model that includes implications for the fishery industry, again, something that's not commonly included today, would be able to output resultant factors, things like influence of coastal and marine environments. And understanding these projections can not only help fisheries anticipate environmental and regulatory changes likely to come with these state climate action plans, but it also serves as a talking point in pushing policy leaders to, veer away from any of those pathways that might be most harmful in their impacts. And then, further, the decarbonization models being built, fisheries can use that as a way to advocate for the inclusion of their own industry data into these models, just to ensure that your unique environmental and economic conditions are considered when ultimately setting those reduction targets. The old adage of if for any model, for any analysis, garbage data in leads to garbage results out. So if, as a fishery industry, you all have some sort of treasure trove of data that you're tracking or would like to track that could influence the outputs of those models, then that's critical. And that's something that we want to factor in. But now we'll take a deeper dive into the idea of decarbonization models. And what I've tried to illustrate here in a pretty crude way is that these models, they really can look like black boxes because, unless you're diving into the function of it, it's hard to know how it works. But, essentially we have a set of inputs on the left side that go into the black box. That black box can be twisted in different ways to show what are the different scenarios we talked about earlier to highlight a range of outcomes based on the toggles that you can't control, economic indicators, oil prices, rate of innovation, just to name a few. And based on those inputs in the scenario chosen, we can then get a set of outputs. And the other side shows what some of those outputs are. So the inputs on the left side includes things like, what's the power grid mix that we're looking at? What's the development and use of carbon capture technology to try to grab and suck out those emissions? What types of public policies and regulations are we putting into place? And the types of decarbonization pathways taken up. So again, from there, it goes into the black box, whatever that specific decarbonization model is. It can look an infinite number of different ways. And then the outputs will, again, vary based on that model, but some common ones to examine include resultant level of pollutants, both greenhouse gases, but also localized pollution into air and water supplies, ecosystem impacts more widely. Is animal life impacted? Are conditions for plant life impacted? Additionally imperative is the economic impacts. What's the most cost-effective way to decarbonize? And who are these economic impacts hitting the most? Are we protecting vulnerable populations? Are we putting certain types of manufacturers or companies or industries at risk of going out of business as a result? And then, of course, the last one that I've highlighted at the bottom in red is focused public interest outcomes. And these focused public interest outcomes, they're, like I said, they're kind of a newer addition to the tool belt of decarbonization models, but they focus on some of the lesser discussed and less included aspects that can and should be included in the models. And some example, I won't walk you through all these like I did the last time, but some examples I've pulled and linked here so you can reference later include a study on how bird populations are impacted by the expanded energy infrastructure needed in decarb models. What human impact is in terms of the populations and quality of life in communities where the major economic driver is mining. Overall equity and justice goals of decarbonization, overall impacts to the forest, and land use and ecological impacts. And on this last one, I think that one might be the most relevant and kind of inspiring for us. So I did pull out one graphic. Again, you're not going to be able to read the specifics or dive into it, but just as an example, I think it's impactful for driving home the example. What you can see is we have in this study 3 different pathways for decarbonization that were studied in California specifically. Those are represented by the 3 different columns that you see there. And based on these different scenarios and the assumed pathway, excuse me, the assumed pathway towards decarbonization, the output graph studies the impact of different types of land, things from protected land to critical habitats to important bird areas and other specific species habitats to the use of agricultural land for produce and livestock. And I just pull this out because it's a great example, from the past few years that highlights how decarbonization models, they can't just be about how we reach net zero, but it has to be really how does it impact our ecosystems and the industries that rely upon them? How does it impact land use? How does it impact, all of that stuff? And that sets up what we on this call care about the most, which is how are these potential decarbonization pathways going to impact the fishery industry? What's the pathway they're on? And also, if it's going the bad way, how can we, get your voice in there to ensure that we're still going to be able to achieve those climate goals, but we can do it in a way that minimizes the negative impacts on the ecosystems and the environments that you all rely upon. That it kind of calls back to the slide from Sarah earlier with the red, yellow, and green of increasing the co-benefits, decreasing the negative impacts, and where can we get the fishery voice in there? So with that, we finally come to the message that we want to drive home and that we hope the rest of the conversation today will cover, which is what are the initial steps that we must take to build those first fishery focused or at least fishery considered decarbonization models. So once again, this is what we're looking to start as the conversation with you all today. And while many of the impacts are already recognized in existing decarbonization models, things like pollutants that affect air and sea quality, water depletion, disruptions to material supply chains, those are ones that will have some relevance to you all, but surely there are some other crucial factors that are yet to be fully incorporated. And we understand that you all are well versed in those ecological impacts of industrial and other human activities. And so we aim to leverage your expertise to that fullest extent. So with your insight and feedback, the aim is that we can effectively highlight fishery-focused considerations to policymakers who are building decarbonization models. And this is particularly crucial in those coastal states that rely on the fishery industry, where your voice is going to carry the most weight, and where we can integrate these findings into local permitting and regulatory landscape. And then, armed with this information, the next step would be, educating voters and leaders, both within the fishery community and outside of it, and empower, everybody to advocate for fishery-friendly decarbonization strategies using, again, that quantifiable and data-driven evidence from a decarbonization model, because that'll give you kind of the most weight and credence behind those pathways you want to push. And by illustrating the potential impacts of various decarbonization scenarios, that allows us to provide stakeholders with the data they need to make informed decisions. So, maybe a government mandate comes in, we need 50 megawatts of clean energy projects. What's the fishery voice of informing a decarbonization model that will highlight the best strategy of, they just want to put all offshore wind. How do you bring the data to show, 50 megawatts of that is going to impact us this way. What if we did it on land? What if we did it with solar? What if we did it with geothermal? It brings to light those conversations in a helpful way, and then ultimately allows the scaling for nationally identifying which decarbonization approaches are most helpful, most detrimental to fisheries, and which least disrupt our critical supply chains. This is all just the beginning, and again, turning this vision into reality, it requires the collaborative efforts to develop models that give that fishery industry voice a unified voice, if you will, and quantified view of its needs. So that's where the conversation today is us calling upon you to help me understand, well, how can we make sure these models are best used and functioning to factor in the conversations and observations you all have already had all the time. The goal is together to brainstorm ideas on developing, indicators, scores, other metrics that we can rate, carbon pathways to integrate that fishery ecosystem impact into the modeling work. And this enables decarbonization planners to identify and take into account, what are the most fishery friendly pathways towards a sustainable future. So it's kind of a bit repetitive, but the goal here again, how we want to learn from fishery scientists everything we can. What are the impacts of decarbonization strategies to the fisheries? How can we measure them, or are those things already being measured? And what are the fishery-related causes and effects that maybe aren't integrated currently today into decarbonization models? From there, we take those impacts and inform people in the world of energy and decarb models, people like myself, how to identify, well, what are the most accurate, useful, impactful strategies to take your input in and integrate them into these models. And armed with that, we then take it to the ultimate climate leaders in government roles who are making these decisions and compel these considerations that we've, together then been able to quantify and study to make sure those results are incorporated. And I've said it a bunch of times, but the goal today is just to start this conversation, covering how these models are used, how they work, and then ultimately be able to use this information to brainstorm ideas on how they might be able to develop a set of those factors that we want to keep in mind moving forward. So the critical way to make this applicable is have the stakeholders in the industry weigh in. That includes the fishery industry, the seafood lovers, the recreational and sustenance fishermen, and the conservation community at large, and ask them all, how do different inputs and outputs, typical and commonly found in decarbonization models, how do they impact you? And so hopefully, this starts as the start of a conversation, and if I've done my job at all, hopefully you have a few ideas spinning in your head. And again, this is the kickstart to something more impactful to lead us down that chain of events. So that's what I have for you guys today, and I'm happy, as we had in the agenda, to entertain any questions you might have, thoughts just to throw out there, even if they're not questions, just your immediate reactions. And I have my email on the slide here if you need to reach out to me later on with anything.
Sarah, I have a question. So Matt, I don't know if when you put when you identify scenarios as one just pathway to have community meetings, what have you. You talked about that first. Do you see that as a good entry point in terms of starting to have a broad-based community conversation to use scenario planning?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and that's the idea, is that and Sarah and I have talked about this a lot. The idea that it's easy as somebody who a group in an industry that might be negatively impacted to try to, you want to throw a wrench out there and you want to say, this is going to negatively impact us. You're not doing the right thing, and almost be, there's probably a better term for it, but a stick in the mud getting in the way of those plans. And it's so easy for, policymakers or climate advocates to just brush that aside and be like, well, you just don't care about climate action. But, clearly the people on this call today and so many across the industry do care about climate action and want to, see decarbonization, see impacts, and just they want to do it in a way that takes into account what you happen to know that isn't being discussed there. So there's value. There's a lot of value in using that as an on-ramp, using those, the scenarios and weighing in on them and giving your information in a way that shows, hey, I'm not trying to poo-poo this climate action or these pathways, and we want to work with you to achieve those goals, because there are goals too, but there are ways to do it that aren't going to negatively impact us. There's going to wait, or at least less. There's always going to be costs. There's always going to be trade-offs, but highlighting ways that, hey, this is something that is going to have an outweighed impact here, and here's the downstream impact on these local economies, these food supply chains, and so getting involved in those scenarios and commenting on this pathway works well, this pathway, it scares us, and here's why, and having research, data to back that up. I think that's the best way to, earn the credibility in those conversations, that, again, you're not just trying to throw a wrench in the plans and say, don't do these decarbonization pathways, but, be more thoughtful in ways X, Y, and Z.
Good, and I'll just comment, because the one group I'm the chair of with Global Ocean Health, that's a tool we use, and and there's a variety of scenario plannings methodologies, but the one that we kind of model or use the most is what I call the plausible futures scenario planning, which is kind of the Dutch shell oil approach, stuff like that. And that seems to be kind of what you're talking about there, Matt, is instead of trying to predict the future, there's an array of futures, and how would the influences affect your ability to achieve what you want in this future, this future, this future, and
Exactly.
It's the idea of engendering, kind of provoke imagination versus interest, huddling and things like that. So I agree with it. I think it's a really good tool.
Yeah, and the decarbonization modelers and really any modeler will be the first to say, the easiest way to lose credibility is to say, if we do X, Y, and Z, here are the exact results. That's going to be wrong. So when they say we have a range of possibilities, we think if we implement these solutions, we'll reduce somewhere between 43 and 52% emissions. And that's not a cop-out. That's a reasonable set of, we can't factor the entire universe of variables into here, but based on the best data we have and the best input we have, this is what we think. And that's where part of our, what I was mentioning is, it's important to make sure your data is a part of that best data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
To build on that, I think in the fisheries world, and we have some folks on the call like Katie and Richard who are probably more familiar with this than me, having spent a lot more time in the federal fisheries management system, but we have something called management strategy evaluation, or MSE for short, in fisheries management, which I think is very analogous to the ways that state climate action planners are using decarbonization modeling. It's basically the concept that you use data and models to show the consequences of various different policy choices, and then you use those choices as the basis to engage the public and stakeholders in a conversation about what the optimal choice would be. So, if anyone's familiar with MSE and wants to weigh in on how that, is useful and could be useful if the same approach was applied to decarbonization, that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, this does look a lot like an enormous MSE. And knowing how difficult it is to actually parameterize an MSE, this one seems like it'd be really scary. But yeah, it's the same conceptually. It would fit perfectly into that sort of rubric that at least fishery managers understand. So you can explain it that way to them, and that won't be as scary. And I too have to go, but thanks. This is a great idea, And if there's anything I can do, Sarah, to help in the future, let me know.
Okay, I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Gareth would feel the same way. If you need for us to try to explain it to the New England Council, we could probably help.
Yeah, definitely. Let's follow up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
And a good presentation, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard.
So if I may, Sarah, also just say, another world that I'm working in is, as I say, I've caught, cooked, and killed a lot of salmon. So now I'm trying to save back for salmon. And so I'm involved with a Columbia River Basin collaborative group that multiple stakeholders, and it's to try to develop authentic recovery plans for the 25 to 27 distinct stocks of salmon in the Columbia River Basin. We're actually having our in-person meeting of the collaborative tomorrow and Friday. I persuaded them to come to Walla Walla, which is great. But what we're doing is we're focused in on working on one particular area of the Columbia River, the Mid-Columbia, looking at one particular stock, the steelhead, summer steelhead, which is listed on the Endangered Species Act. And so what we're doing is we know we've got a good bit of modeling on the salmon ecology side, and we're just trying to bring that all in, and so we have the best of the ecological knowledge as our foundation. But we want to hybridize into the model what we call the social, cultural, and economic implications of different recovery actions, stuff like that. So we're able to simultaneously say, oh, if we do this recovery action, what will be the likely effect within the community around the social, cultural, economic? And so we're working on that on the recovery side of salmon. And I think it's also, I'm seeing a lot of that, or the kind of resonant, Matt, what you're talking about is to be able to have, even if we call it when we were developing the salmon side of it, we called it the salmon slider. Like, what would happen if you move the dial this way, stuff like that? How would it light up the salmon world? But now what we want to do is be able to say, oh, not only how will movement light up the salmon world, but how will it light up the social, cultural, and economic world too? So we just have a better, understanding when we go talk to decision makers as well as the general public, and then the ultimate goal is to be able, with the collaborative, is to float all boats, just try to have action plans that will actually be net positive for the social, cultural, and economic versus this is zero-sum game. So interesting kind of, resonant models, resonant model there to Matt, what you were talking about,
Absolutely.
So I posted in the chat, we've gotten to a really small group. So I hope that means we can have an engaging conversation, but if folks do need to drop off, I know a lot of you are on the East Coast and it's 5 o'clock. Don't feel bad if you do. But I posted in the chat the questions we had planned to use to prompt the discussion. We wanted to ask fishermen how we should go about defining fishery friendliness so that modelers can build scenarios that are as fishery friendly as possible. And then we wanted to ask our scientists, what tools, approaches, data sets, resources, or analogous processes have been done elsewhere that we could draw upon to develop a really analytically robust framework for integrating fishery impact considerations into decarbonization modeling. Given we have such a small group, I don't think we necessarily need to stick to those two questions. What I'm personally interested in hearing from all of you and learning together, especially Kevin, you've just given us a lot of examples of work that you've done and how you went about sort of taking a concept from a concept to, a plan and a process and a team and, making stuff happen, which is what we've struggled to do here. So I'd also be interested in throwing a question out to you guys of sort of where do we go from here? We have some of Matt's time paid for by a Sea Grant project in Rhode Island, and that project, which is being managed by Fred and Shay, who had to drop off, has a small amount of additional funding, like very small, like $10,000, to support other scientific work complementary to what Matt has talked about, to sort of fill in some of those gaps that Matt has alluded to in his presentation. And we don't necessarily yet know how to go about doing that, who to bring to the table with such a tiny pot of funding, how to get the right experts involved, how to build a team that can actually do some of this. So I'm going to throw that question on the list as well. So I say just don't even raise your hand. Let's just have a chat. Anything that comes to mind on any of that.
Well, ever the unbashful one. I'll say one of the things I think that has to, from the get-go with fishermen and fishing world and fisher friendly is say, what's the value proposition? What at the end of the day, what value do you retain by changing practices or whatever, doing different actions, as well as, how does a fisherman, react to, or in the management of fishery action when we get changing water systems, temperature, stuff like that. We have changing stocks. It's going to be a lot of challenge to the fishery councils as we get fisheries, fish moving around. But one of the I just came from a slow fish gathering in South Carolina. And one of the things that we introduced there were some folks that are following the 100% fish, approach from Iceland, is to realizing, there's a lot of value in it around particularly a wild caught captured fishery that we're just leaving on the cutting floor, or we're not actualizing the total value that a fish can provide, pharmaceutical, whatever. So Iceland is really leading that charge. So then I just was making some notes listening to Matt too, is that if we have, again, this is a value thread, if we can increase the value that a fisherman gets for each, or a fisher gets for each onboarded fish, then the value proposition increases. I mean, we're creating value for the fleet. And then I think when you have value and you got a certainty of value, then you have more generosity to engage changes, and even, trying to change, even practices, in terms of what kind of boat you got, what kind of, the type of, fishing you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think another value that comes from is zero waste, which ties into 100% fish, utilizing the full fish, but also how can the fleet be a leader on zero footprint? So I think so I just was thinking of 100, 100% fish, which is also 100% fish with zero waste and zero footprint as a calling card, is kind of a champion. Like, we can do that. And then, I'm working also on I'm trying to write a blog for the Marine Fish Conservation Network that it was attempted to be out in October with the National Seafood Month. I didn't get it out. But it's to comment on NOAA's National Seafood Strategy and the implementation plan draft that they should put out. How can that be a vehicle that actually embraces what we're talking about here in terms of fishery friendly, climate embracing, fishery. So trying to also figure out a way, how can you at the highest level of NOAA fishery embed these value propositions. Then lastly, when I have conversations with the Marine Fish Conservation Network colleagues, I also bring to the conversation is what USDA does, Department of Agriculture does with farmers, because I work a lot with farmers on salmon recovery. And the Farm Bill sends so much money out to de-risk the changes, to subsidize the changes that farmers do for conservation. Why don't we have similar mechanisms that NOAA fisheries for fishermen or fishers to do change, to incentivize their change? And so there's a lot there, but it's a lot that is in my mind, and I don't have it all synergized yet.
Some of those topics actually tie into the other major effort that we've been coordinating through the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign for the last 2 years. And the size of that effort is a big part of why this effort has struggled to get off the ground. And that effort is we call it the Transition to a Low Carbon Fishing Fleet project, where there was a team of 5 of us, all fishermen with some social science chops. in 5 different states. And over the course of more than a year, we interviewed almost 150 commercial fishing vessel owners about their views on a variety of different technologies, strategies, innovations that could reduce the amount of fossil fuel dependence of their vessels, either through efficiency measures or alternative power sources, including both electrification and a variety of different alternative fuels. We also interviewed port managers, technical assistance intermediaries, grant managers, program administrators at the state and federal level. And we are hoping to have those results out just in time for a major political shift in our country, which is probably the worst possible timing, but that was fate. So yeah, and we're trying to, after that, that is just fact finding. It was just collecting impressions from all of these people in that whole ecosystem. And after that, we want to start sort of building, organizing, building an agenda together. So we're hoping to coordinate sort of on 3 fronts, actually, a team for the technical nerdy types in the fishing industry, a team to advise writers at National Fishermen on a series of articles they're going to do that will deep dives into the technological aspects of all of this stuff to answer fishermen's burning questions about, what will work on my vessel, what won't, is it safe, what'll it cost, etc. And then we're trying to launch a fellowship program for fishermen, for emerging leaders, young and mid-career fishermen within specific states, to take on the role of, working with fishermen in fisheries orgs in their states to define an action agenda at the state level. And that's a really good, because it's state level, it's a great opportunity for younger, less experienced fisheries leaders to get their feet wet in some of this. And so they'll be receiving training in community organizing and all of the technology pathways and the policy pathways that we've looked at through our research phase. And then they will be given support and a stipend to go out and go forth and define an action agenda at their state level. And then we also need to, and this is the part that sort of has a big question mark hanging over it with the administration change, is we're going to convene a bi-coastal think tank of fishermen and fisheries leaders to define a federal policy agenda and start interfacing with our federal agencies, our federal elected officials. And we've done a tremendous amount of great research, and that was really going to be awesome. And now I'm not quite sure what that looks like. If anyone knows, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. But I just wanted to let you know that all that's too.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe on the last point is that being a resident, I'm actually an Oregon resident right across the border from Washington. I fished in Alaska, so I'm a Pacific Coast fellow, and we have the Washington, Oregon, California. When you look at the electoral map, it's solid blue along with the Atlantic seaboard. But the truth of those states is that there's a mountain spine that goes down Washington, Oregon, and into California. The west coast, the west of that spine is all blue. The east side of that is all red. So it's really even a thinner, strip of the coast that trends blue. But the entire state of Washington voted to retain the climate commitment legislation, which is huge, and it also voted to retain a capital gains tax on. So two significant initiatives that were retained by the state residents. So what I'm thinking about now is so Washington has a climate commitment legislation. California does. Oregon does not. But how can we create a coastal, alliance that so that we then work at the state level, and to be able to then go to at least Washington. That legislation is creating billions of dollars that are now being used on action around the state. It's already happening. So part of how to get into that funding pathway to help us do what we're doing. And the other thing is to be, what I'd love to have fishermen be able to do is, because we are out on the water And seeing the early signals of tremendous change, because the ocean is showing tremendous change and it's been absorbing carbon for decades, is to put our call out to the other food makers on the terrestrial side, to call out to farmers. So can we have a somehow, that's messaging, but also outreach. Can we have a common cause with other food producers, and to be able to say, you're affecting what's happening out in our world in carbon waste, but also in pollution waste. So to have just these generate larger and more effective conversations. That's maybe out of that latter is out of the scope of what we're working on here, but it's part messaging also too. And you'll see, Global Ocean Health, we're about to come out with a new brochure, and one of the key things about it is to help the ocean enable us to keep feeding ourselves. So to have that connection on the food side, and so then you get consumer, engagement, things like that. But just get, it's I think all of that, Sarah, is just getting, as we're trying to do, is just get more engagement. Have our voice be heard in wider, broader, deeper ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe to segue back to the topic of today's webinar, I mean, one of the interesting dynamics, especially I think on the East Coast, but probably beyond, is of the recent election, is that in part, it bodes ill for climate action. The general consensus is that we're going to see less climate action generally from this administration. And that's not good for fisheries, right? Inaction is bad for fisheries, but at the same time, some of the Biden administration's priority actions have also been perceived, at least by most in the fishing industry, as bad for fisheries. So I think there was a collective sigh of relief from the East Coast fishing community because of Trump's promise a few months ago to stop offshore wind on day one of his administration. So it's a complex. It's complex.
Yeah.
My hope is that we do see a slowdown of offshore wind because it's been going awfully fast. It's cut a lot of corners, both in terms of environmental impact and also community engagement, and I don't like to see that. At the same time, I hope that the fishermen who are breathing that sigh of relief, and many of whom voted for Trump and are partly responsible for that, don't stop there, and that they step up and say, okay, we got what we wanted on offshore wind. Now, how are we going to define climate, pathways that get us to where we need to go on greenhouse gas emissions in ways that are more fishery friendly? And that is, back to something earlier you said, Kevin, what's the value proposition to fishermen to getting behind that narrative and making those asks? I'm not sure, but hopefully there's enough of us who just care to carry that load for the rest of us. Matt, what is your sense of sort of how the recent outcome of the election will change the way the EPA acts? They're the ones funding these climate pollution reduction grant projects, or the way that states act. I mean, for one thing, like prior to last Tuesday, I was thinking that for fishermen who are concerned primarily about offshore wind, as many of us are, that one of the primary tasks in engaging in these state level CPRG processes was going to be to ask the decarbonization modelers hired by these states to include a scenario among their various scenarios that is less dependent on offshore wind. I was anticipating that would be a tough ask. However, given the outcome of last week's election, I'm now anticipating it may be a much, much easier ask. We may not even have to ask. They might just have to do it anyway. But I'd love to run that hypothesis by you and see what you think.
Yeah, I think you're right on. The among all of the, let's take a step back. We've learned with the Trump administration, and we'll see what Trump 2.0 is versus Trump 1.0. But one of the biggest themes, I think, when you look at all of the energy and policy stuff, was just uncertainty. It was, you couldn't necessarily know, all right, campaign promise turned into action. How likely is it? It was very sometimes ambiguous. So that creates a challenge, even if it's certainty of a negative action or a positive action. Having that certainty allows stakeholders to plan and adjust. So, just on a philosophical level, the lower level of certainty makes everything more challenging. That said, I agree with you that, if anything is going to slow down in terms of energy and climate action, number one is offshore wind. Even before the election, it was trending that way, where people who were advocating for it were seeing all of those challenges of the vineyard vines. Was that the one where there was the turbine that kind of broke apart? Or there's just a lot of negative press, if nothing else, negative actions, but then negative press causing a slowdown there. So I would definitely expect that a very large slowdown to a complete stop of offshore wind is going to be a likely scenario in the near term. When it comes to the states, I think that's where you're going to see the pull in the opposite direction, kind of more towards climate action, where for years ahead of time, when the federal government was kind of deadlocked or slow or resistant to move towards climate action, it was the states, the Washingtons, the New Yorks, the Massachusetts, the Californias, who said, all right, well, we're going to take up the mantle of that action because, especially on the coast, we see it impacting us most right away. So I think there was a little bit of a slowdown of state action in the past 4 years because there was a lot of leadership from the federal side. Now, when that leadership is maybe less expected, I think you're going to see states really try to take the ball and run with it more moving forward, meaning it'll be even more important to engage on the state level and the local level than the federal level at this moment.
So, Sarah, if I may, I've been, as many of us are doing, just combing, what comes across a transom for some potential positive news, right? So our good expressionist Heather Cox Richardson yesterday in her daily, she said the following. She put in there the following: "It is not clear that even MAGA Republicans want to kill the green energy initiatives in the IRA that have brought new factories and good jobs to more Republican-dominated states than Democrat-dominated states. Today," this was yesterday, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods, asked the incoming administration not to change Biden's climate policy dramatically, saying that the lack of consistency on climate change is bad for the economy. So this, Matt, what you're talking about, uncertainty, quote, "I don't think the challenge or the need to address global emissions is going away. Anything that happens in the short term would just make the longer term that's much more challenging," unquote. And then the final thing that Heather writes is, "Exxon has invested heavily in the carbon capture industry. In 2023, Woods predicted that the company's low carbon business could generate more money than its traditional oil and gas products in little as a decade, telling investors he expects carbon capture to be a multi-trillion-dollar business." So here are some voices that are, we're going to look for breaks on the Trump administration, and I don't think there's not much spine in the GOP in Congress. So, we have to look for breaks coming, feet on the pedal, the brake pedal. And so if we get more voices like this, it could be helpful, but also let's find out what they're doing. What kind of, Matt, I don't know what kind of investment they're doing in carbon capture. Brad and I, Sarah, with Global Ocean Health, this is something we've been kind of preparing for, stuff like that, to help bring the market, an effective market, into this world that helps us on a market way. And also, if we can do that in a way, I think that'll also help embrace more fishermen. If you, instead of a regulatory response, there's a market to here, how we carbon capture, that I think that can be more comforting message to fishermen, a lot of fishermen who, have an adverse reaction, to regulation.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And yeah, the CEO of Exxon, there are a lot of headlines coming out of his comments at the COP conference, and he's right. I can't speak specifically to what the technologies, developments or investments are, but it's been true for at least a decade that, the oil majors, obviously they still see oil and gas as a major part of their business and as a part of our energy ecosystem for years to come. But they also they've seen the writing on the wall and recognize not only does it make good business sense for us to diversify, but like you're saying, we also have the expertise to be the leaders here. So it's not, carbon capture is one of those. Hydrogen fuel is another one where they're like, we could be a leader here and stay as a leader in all of these things. So the lack of certainty is always tough, though it's tougher on the smaller guys. The Exxons and the BPs, they have a 10-20 year plan, probably further out, of we're protecting ourselves, we're going to invest in on these alternative technologies as well, both because we have to from a business sense, because we have the expertise to know, for hydrogen, for carbon capture, that for geothermal, we have all the expertise on drilling, on putting things into these different systems. So we're best positioned to do so. So you're going to see a lot of those type of actions continue to move forward. And the challenge is more on the smaller actors who can't just be that forward looking and have to react to what's certain. And that's where the challenge lies, I think.
Yeah. So Sarah, you're going to come out with the summary or the distillation of all those interviews and some things like that. I really look forward to that. I'm really glad you guys are doing it. Got that cultural inventory, which is so important. But it also, with the Marine Fish Conservation Network, I talked with the directors, Deputy Director Tom Sadler, and we try to think what is the, is the working waterfront a good way to talk about and aggregate, a message about, the health of the working waterfront. So it's you're talking about electrifying the fleet, but also what can we do on, other parts of the working waterfront. Do you sense that is a message going to come out when you talk with port people, stuff like that? So let's take a kind of a holistic approach moving forward.
We have a chapter on ports, and I admit that that's the one chapter I didn't do any of the interviews for, and I haven't even read the draft. It's wonderful when other people just go and do the work and I don't have to get involved. That's the one chapter I didn't have to get involved in. And I will read it before we publish it, but I know certainly in Point Judith, where I fish in Rhode Island, there's been conversations about sort of an integrated approach that the port, and Katie can speak to this as well, being part of one of the largest businesses located there, but the port's owned by the state, which is helpful because it means they take a direct interest in it and in leveraging whatever they can to help with the port infrastructure, including greening it. So I think there's some conversations taking place there, among the state, the port, the leaseholders like the town dock where Katie works, the fishermen, on sort of thinking about an integrated approach that would reduce emissions, that would leverage that state property and the businesses there to reduce emissions associated with Rhode Island seafood.
Hey, Sarah, I'll hop in. I haven't been involved in any conversations related to any type of changeover for, say, engine wise for greening and less carbon. I did ask Ryan after you held that solar panel session if solar panels were feasible, and he said they had looked into them at one point, but solar panels, seagulls, and quahogs don't mix. So it was kind of, I think a no-go at this point right now for that. It's just, you've been down there, how active it is with, the dropping of things. So I don't know. I do know that I do work for a company who does believe this is real, wants to be in business for the years to come. It's a family business. So, we're up for any discussion and, ideas that, we can help with along the way. So, but as for any type of engine changes, Mike Roderick would be the one to reach out and ask if he's been approached for any discussions involving that.
And Mike was one of the people we interviewed for our 148 fishermen interviews.
Oh,
So
good. I'm glad he participated.
knowledge is, yeah, his expert knowledge is included.
Good. Okay.
Well, we've got one more minute. I want to invite Sophia to give us a pitch for our next webinar in this series. I'll share my screen, Sophia, and you can talk about it.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for that conversation. It was super fascinating. So as Sarah mentioned, I'll be hosting the next webinar, and it's on December 10th, I believe at 4 p.m., the same time as this webinar. And it will be on kind of looking at the Maine's climate action planning process, which is the Maine Won't Wait report. The first iteration of the report was published in 2020. And the second plan is coming out the updated version of the plan is coming out December 1st, 2024. And so this is the Maine's climate action plan, and it'll be the basis, the 2024 report, updated report, will be the basis for Maine's CCAP processes. So it's one of the first kind of outlines for what CCAP processes will look like that are coming out nationwide. And there was a huge engagement and outreach and engagement push for involving fishermen in the process. There's a coastal marine working group that fishermen were engaged in. However, there are kind of mixed takes on the effectiveness of the engagement process of fishermen. So what I'm doing as part of the guide that I mentioned earlier for state planners is conducting interviews with people who were either engaged formally in the process through working groups or committees or outreach events, and people who were engaged informally, fishermen specifically, and taking all through these interviews have takeaways of what worked well, what didn't work well, etc., that I will present to fishermen and state planners to help inform future engagement of fishermen in similar processes, specifically the CCAP processes. Sorry, it's a little bit late in the day. I got a little tired. But hopefully that made sense. If you have questions, please let me know. But I really hope to see you all there. The interviews have been really fascinating so far, and I think that the webinar will be a great way to both engage fishermen and state planners in interesting conversations about what each party needs from each other in these upcoming processes.
Sophia, do you also want to talk about the survey? I can post the link in the chat.
Definitely. So we made a survey for everyone who attended this event. We'll also send it out via email. Sarah's putting it in the chat now. It'll ask you just some questions about fishery-friendly, what fishery-friendly climate solutions look like, and kind of your own summary of like what you learned from Matt's part of the presentation, as well as some feedback on the webinar itself so we can improve our future webinars. And one other part of the survey that we'd love for you to fill it out is if you're interested in engaging in this kind of decarbonization modeling process in your state, you can indicate that, and Sarah, the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign, will reach out to you with more resources and support. So it would be great if everyone could fill out this survey who attended the event so that we could have more information on what fishery-friendly climate solutions mean to fishermen and fishery scientists, as well as future opportunities for engagement with the Fishery-Friendly Climate Action Campaign.
And we might actually mine some of the survey input to use for the newsletters that we're sending to state climate action planners. So Sophia has made a list of the people who are actually doing these CCAP processes in 8 different states across Alaska, the Northwest, or the West Coast, and the Northeast. And we're going to be bombarding them politely with information over the next 14 months of how they can engage the fishing community and center fishery impacts in their decarbonization planning. So anything you put in that survey is content we can actually use in those newsletters, and we won't quote you by name unless you want us to. So let us know.
Sophia, could you send that out by email? I'm working on my iPad, and it's kind of, going between chats. It gets a little difficult.
I'm going to send it out in the same email as the the link to this recording
Perfect.
either tonight or tomorrow. Yeah. So
Wonderful. So I have one last question, Sarah, and I look forward to seeing you at Seattle Expo next week, which is before January 20th, do we have any kind of sense that EPA may expedite funding out the door? I think there's a lot of kind of, you're getting also media feedback about hurry up and do some things before the January 20th. Do you get a sense that there may be more funding that could get out the door real quickly to help us?
I'd love to know the answer to that question. Matt or anyone?
I would say, I don't think so. Just because the lever to pull to get the funding available, it's not usually that quick, and it's a little bit irresponsible in a traditional environment for it to be that quick. So I don't think there'll be any new funding coming out in that way, but certainly existing programs or grants that are out there, there might be a little bit more efficiency in trying to get them across the finish line before the end of January. But I don't know. Haven't heard any specifics about that.
I guess the converse of that question too is there any chance that EPA funds or other government funds that have for climate action that have been committed could be clawed back after January 20th?
That's I'll echo your answer to the last question. I'd love to know that. There's definitely a lot of concern that that's the case, but I've also read people much smarter than me who said, there's some pretty good prevention of that built into how the laws are written. So there's, specific, to the IRA funding specifically, there's only a certain amount of the pie that's eligible to be clawed back at this point. But, we'll see how that actually plays out in practice.
That could be one of the sources of creativity for the Orange Man's administration, creative clawbacks. So by the way, when I say Orange Man, when in his first administration, I went to a presentation speech by Angela Davis, the good old radical from the 60s, 70s, and she said, I honor an African tradition, which is if you say the person's name, you honor that person. So she would always say the current resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. She would never say his name. She would always say, yeah.
And for the record, the Fishery-Friendly Climate Action Campaign is nonpartisan, and we welcome all political perspectives.
Yeah, cut that out. Cut that recording. Cut the recording. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, we're certainly in an unusual moment here, so it was really great to see you all and chew over some of this, from the very focused on decarbonization pathway modeling to the general milieu we're living in. So thank you all for being here. I look forward to
Matt again, thanks for your presentation. I'm glad you got it recorded, Sarah, too, and Sophia, so further sharing. So thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Go on.